the V-1 and V-2 rockets. And so Eisenhower was dead set against von Braun working on that project until the Soviets got Sputnik into space. The government acted very surprised. How did they do that? The government actually knew exactly what the Soviets were doing. We have in our archives an astounding science fiction magazine published 3 months after Sputnik got into space. The editor was a science fiction writer by the name of John Campbell, and he took the United States government to task. He said, your government knew about this. The Soviets were talking about it in their newspapers. They were publishing channels you could listen to their radio signals on. They were publishing launch dates. And the government just doesn't want you to know that they got caught red-handed. So that really was the impetus that started the United States into space. Of course, 30 days after that, they launched Sputnik 2, which carried Laika the dog. Laika was a mutt taken off the street, trained, and sent into orbit. I think Laika lived about 7 hours, and then Sputnik orbited for several months before it came back into the atmosphere and burned up. One of the highlights is Belka and Strelka. On this mission, there were 42 mice, a gray rabbit, 2 rats, flies, and several plants and fungi, and all of them survived. Sputnik 5 was this mission right here. Sputnik 5 made 17 revolutions around the planet Earth and spent 27 hours in orbit. These were the first Earth-born creatures to orbit Earth and actually return alive. And the Soviets did that. When you think about it, they actually put, as we talked about, the satellite, first man in space, woman in space, first man to walk in space, first woman to walk in space, first multi-person crew, first space station. They really did everything except go to the moon. And when the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, came back from her mission, she, on a goodwill tour, said, we're going to the moon in 1968. And for many reasons, one of those reasons, their chief designer, who was their equal to R. Werner von Braun, passed away during surgery from a medical condition. They did not, of course, make it to the moon in 1968. But this mission right here, the Soviets were studying organisms' reaction to exposure to gravity in outer space. You see these 2 photographs right here? These were so revered by the Soviets that when they passed away, they were sent to a taxidermist, and they're now on display in a museum in Russia. The puppy Strelka went on to have a litter of 6, and one of those was given to President John F. Kennedy for his kids. And then that had a litter of puppies that JFK referred to jokingly as pupniks, and passed around among his friends. First man in space, of course, was Yuri Gagarin. And Yuri Gagarin got to be the first man in space because when we sent Ham, the chimpanzee, on a mission, there was a problem, and Ham's flight was aborted automatically by a computer because his rocket engine burned up the fuel 5 seconds early. And we didn't know why that happened. 5 seconds, that doesn't seem like a whole lot, but it pushed him from about 114 miles in altitude to 150 some miles in altitude. And von Braun said, we are not going to send a human being into space until we know why that happened. That human being was supposed to have been Alan Shepard. Shepard argued with him and went to the NASA hierarchy and said, I will take the risk. And was told, when it comes to rockets, Werner is king. And in the 3 months it took them to figure out why that problem existed, the Soviets set up Yuri Gagarin. And that's how they got the first man in space. Luna 1 and Luna 2 were launched in 1959. They were the first spacecraft to escape Earth's gravity. One was supposed to have hit the moon, but it failed and actually became the first object to circle the sun. And 2 was the first spacecraft to actually hit the moon. This mission right here had several successive spacecraft to it. It was the first spacecraft to perform an interplanetary flight and the first to fly past the planet Venus. That was in 1961. Radio contact was lost before, so there was no data that was actually gleaned from that mission. And then eventually, 2 missions later, they did get the first spacecraft to land on Venus and get photographs of it. Gagarin Titov was the youngest person ever to go to space until 2021, when a Dutch teenager on a private mission went into space. He was only 25 years old. He was went on a whirlwind tour around the planet as well. You can see him up there with President John F. Kennedy. He would be the first person to orbit the Earth multiple times, a total of 17. He was the first to pilot a spaceship and spend more than a day in space. He was the first to sleep in orbit. He was the first to eat a meal in orbit. And guess what that led to? The first person to get space sickness and vomit in orbit. He was also a photographer, and he was the first photographer in space. Vostok 3 and 4 here took place in 1962. It orbited the Earth 64 times. That was Vostok 3, over nearly 4 days in space. It was a feat that would not be matched by us until the Gemini program. One of the cosmonauts, Pavel Popovich, in Vostok 4, made 48 Earth orbits, and between the two of them, these 2 capsules passed within 4 miles of each other, and they were the first ship-to-ship radio contact in space. You can see how far along they are compared to the United States. And of course, Valentina Tereshkova, she was the first woman in space. This was a bit of Soviet propaganda over here. Before they sent her up, she had her hair cut, and that was sent out by AP across the world. They called her a cosmonaut, not a cosmonaut. This here?
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Called her a cosmonaut. She was supposed to only go up for a short time, but she was doing so well that they sent her on several orbits around the planet Earth. And when she came back down, she had more time than all of the American men put together. It was a great propaganda coup for the Soviets. 20 years later, they had the first woman to walk in space, Svetlana Savitskaya. And both of them are still alive. And then they launched Voskhod 1, which carried more than 1 person and had a crew actually of 3. It was supposed to only have a crew of 2, but the politicians wanted more propaganda coups, and so they forced 3 cosmonauts into this capsule right here, and because of that, they couldn't wear spacesuits. So it's the first actual mission launched with crew men that had no spacesuits on. They had a couple of disasters as well. Valentin Bondarenko was, there's good evidence that he could have been the first man in space as a cosmonaut. He was doing isolation studies for several weeks, was doing some cleaning on his arm from medical devices that had been taped there, cleaning it off with alcohol, and he tossed it across the room into the wastebasket, missed the wastebasket. It hit a hot plate that was on, and it was an oxygen atmosphere, and the room exploded. And it burned him everywhere except the bottom of his feet because he was standing. They took him to the hospital. He lived several hours. The death officer there just happened to be Yuri Gagarin. And he took, before he passed away, took the entire blame for what happened in that particular incident. This was a disaster that was covered up for years, and it's known as the Netherlands disaster. They were testing a new rocket, if you're familiar with it, and it wouldn't ignite. There were 300 people in bunkers around this launch pad, and they waited several hours because they'd already hit the button and the rocket failed miserably, didn't do anything. So after several hours, Netherlands ordered them out of the bunker to see if they could figure out what went wrong. They were out on the launch pad and the rocket exploded. killed, it's believed, up to 300 people. All that was left of Marshal Nedelin here were his medals. He was vaporized. Some of them were killed from poisoning, toxic fumes, other things such as that. And true to Soviet newspaper information, they said he was killed in an airplane crash. This is the luckiest man that ever lived. He was part of that crew out there at the launch pad. And he decided he wanted a cigarette. And of course, you can't smoke around rockets with a cigarette. So he went back to the bunker, which was a safe area, and just about the time he's lighting the cigarette, the rocket exploded. And he was the only survivor of that entire incident. This will give you an idea. This is from a Soviet film which I've edited. So you see the rocket on the stand there. There it goes. It burned for several hours. And that information did not come out until the end of the Cold War. So they covered that up for many, many decades. So that brings us to the space station, Salyut 1. You can see all the steps that they went through. They had their disasters. We had our disasters in the United States. They had their successes. They were far more initially successful at us. And part of that can be, I think, attributed to the fact that they had far more pressure, the Soviets did, to make leaps and bounds. They would just simply adapt their capsules and adapt their equipment to the next mission. As the one you saw, they squeezed 3 people in a capsule designed for 1 person. You probably are aware that the propaganda was just extremely incredible, and it was really kind of put a depressive mood across the NASA and what we were trying to achieve. But we were redesigning everything as we went along. You look at the Mercury capsule, you look at the Gemini capsule, you look at the Apollo capsule. We took steps by steps. When the Apollo 1 fire took place, NASA shut down the program for a year and retooled completely. So let's talk about Salyut 1. This took place from April 19th to October 11th of 1971. It spent 175 days in orbit, but it was only occupied for 24 days. Only 2 missions actually went to Salyut 1, and one of them would end in disaster. Salyut has a couple of different meanings in translation. One is salute, and one is fireworks. The Salyut program lasted for 15 years, and there was both civilian and military research done. When you see a black box up here, that was a military mission. So the civilian, as I said earlier, would cover up what they were doing militarily in space. And as I mentioned, it was real spy versus spy stuff. So in the early 1960s, they designed what was known as the ALMAS program, and that was their top secret military space station program. Both of these programs had a 3-tier concept to them. They had an orbital piloted station, and that was basically the space station. So Salyut took the program from one component to eventually components and modules that would be part of the entire space station. But initially, it was simply one component. And there were two in the different programs, two different designations. One was DOS or DOS, DOS, that stands for Durable Orbital Station. That is the public program. The other was OPS, the Military Orbital Piloted Station, OPS. There was also the second tier, what was known as a cargo block supply craft that could ferry uncrewed supplies to the space station, to Salyut. And there was a VA spacecraft, which would have been for the crew to go and the crew to return. So that would have been reusable as well. And it was the Soviets' response, Salyut was, to our discussion of what was known as the U.S. Manned Orbital Laboratory at the time. This is basically what the Salyut looked like. You can see all of the different components. You can see the crew department there. You can see the docking port. And the initial Salyuts had just one docking port. And the first craft, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, were short-term duration programs. They would go up, they would do what they needed to do, they would prove the viability of it, and they would return back to the Soviet Union. 6 and 7 would be longer missions, and they would comprise most of the days actually spent over the entire 15-year program in space. This diagram right here will show you Salyut 1 was a DOS, Salyut 2, or DOS 2 was a failed Salyut, DOS 3 was a Cosmos, and down here what Salyuts were actually military programs. So Salyut 1, the first mission to Salyut 1 was Soyuz 10, and that launched on April 22nd of 1971. It would carry a crew of 3, and here's the crew of Soyuz 10 right here. They were unable to dock with it. They were the first crew to visit the space station. And when they tried to dock, the probe got into the docking mechanism and got stuck, and they couldn't get it loose. And so they kind of hung there with this probe in the space station, trying to wriggle it around with their equipment and trying to pull loose, and nothing, they couldn't get out. The danger is that they can't dock, they can't get in. What happens if they can't get loose? And so finally, one of these crew members decided to throw a breaker switch, and threw the breaker switch off, and the probe let loose. And they were able to back up and come down to the planet. But that's not the end of the story. If you see these photographs up here, they landed far away from where they were supposed to land in a very frozen area of the Soviet Union. It took a while for a crew to get to them, and they were stuck inside the capsule for a period of time. And you can see all of the work that is going in to rescue the crew members. This was several times during the early years of the Soviet program. This was not the first time this would happen. One mission that returned to the planet landed in the middle of a forest, and a helicopter came to pick them up, and they couldn't land. So the next day they sent in crews with chainsaws and cut down all the trees around it. And then they flew in a tub, heated up some water, got the cosmonauts out, put them in the water, took film of them taking a bath on their joyous return to the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets would use every opportunity for propaganda. And this was one of those missions right there, where it took a while to get to them, took a while to get out. They were stuck inside for quite a while. And they didn't know, because they were in there for so long, when they finally got there and were finally able to extract them, would they even be alive, because their radio had failed. This particular mission right here was the second and last mission that would go. They were able to reach the space station and dock. They spent 23 days aboard Salyut 1. As they were returning, a valve failed in the spacecraft, in the Soyuz 11, and all of the air vented out. And when they parachuted down and landed and the rescue crew opened up the capsule, they had all died from asphyxiation. So none of them survived that. They were named as heroes of the Soviet Union and given quite honors upon their services. So when spacecraft finally is no longer needed, where does it go? It's got to go somewhere when it returns to the planet. And you wouldn't believe the amount of material that's underwater, what's known as Point Nemo. Point Nemo is the ocean location farthest from any land mass. Underwater there is Skylab. Some of Skylab hit Western Australia, if you remember. Several Salyut, 6 in fact, I believe. 140 Russian supply rockets, 6 Japanese cargo transfer rockets, and 5 European Space Agency cargo transfer rockets, all basically guided to land and crash into the ocean there, where theoretically it's not a danger to anything. Of course, when you're carrying toxic chemicals and things like that, it makes you wonder in the long term what kind of effect that has. So Salyut 2 would be a military operation. It was super secret, except for the fact that Leonid Brezhnev invited Fidel Castro to come to the Soviet Union for a tour of Salyut 2. Salyut 2 would be aloft from April 3rd to May 28th of 1973. It was not a long mission. It was only occupied for a few days of that. 3 days after the launch of Salyut 2, the Proton rocket's spent third stage exploded due to pressure changes within the tanks. Cloud of debris, some of which followed a similar trajectory, hit the space station. Actually, I take that back. It was not occupied at all. It hit it, it destroyed the solar cells, and it went careening into the ocean, into the Pacific Ocean. Salyut 3 was military as well. It was only occupied for 15 days. I stand corrected there. However, this had some amazing new features to it for the cosmonauts. It had a shower. It had standing sleeping stations. It had fold-away beds, and it had Velcro floors, so the cosmonauts could walk across the surface and not float around everywhere. It also had, for their entertainment, a magnetic chess set, a library, a tape cassette deck and tapes they could listen to. It had an exercise treadmill in it. It also had an onboard 23 millimeter cannon, which, being a military mission, the purpose of that wasn't discussed, but there were some tests done where they would launch it out into space from inside. It also had the first water recycling facilities that were used on the station. It was scheduled for 3 crews. 1 boarded. Soyuz 14 was the launch capsule that took them there. A second failed to dock, Soyuz 15, so the Soviets canceled the 3rd mission and they deorbited it and crashed it into the ocean. Salyut 4 was considered a huge success, considering what had happened to the first 3 deaths, inability to dock, debris hitting the space station, only 1 crew out of several that was supposed to have been part of the program. So Salyut 4 was considered a huge success. 3 crews attempted to make stays aboard Salyut 4. It had an orbiting telescope on it. Soyuz 17 and 18 actually docked. Soyuz 18A suffered a launch abort and never made it into the trajectory that would have taken them there. The second stay was for 63 days duration, and an unmanned capsule, Soyuz 20, remained docked to that station for 20 months, that unmanned capsule bringing them supplies to replenish what they needed. And so with Salyut 4, they were able to prove that long-term missions were a viability. Salyut 5 was a military mission as well. There were 4 crewed missions that were planned to go there. It was launched on Salyut 5 was launched in 1976 and was up for a little more than a year to August 8th of 1977. Besides being military, it also did have some scientific experiments aboard it. It had fish in an aquarium and microgravity. How are fish in water going to live and thrive in a microgravity atmosphere? It observed the sun, conducted a televised conference with school pupils in the Soviet Union. So they set up this program, whereas we have here, you could talk to astronauts on board the International Space Station. They were actually the first to do that. The cosmonauts remained aboard Salyut 5 until the 24th of August in 1976 when they returned to Earth, the first there. The mission had been expected to last longer. However, the atmosphere within the spacecraft started to deteriorate because contamination with nitric acid fumes from a fuel leak. So they were taken out and brought back to Earth a little bit early. What was life like aboard the Salyut? Well, we know they had a chess set. We know they had a library. We know they had tapes. And so this will give you an idea of the space they had and the experiments they undertook and the camaraderie over here, which once again is probably a lot of Soviet propaganda, because you see Leonid Brezhnev in this picture right up here. As we often have pictures of the United States president up there, they had Brezhnev up there. So these first missions proved that, even though some of the setbacks early on, these first missions proved that a space station was viable. It would work. You could live, you could thrive, you could conduct experiments, you could enjoy some downtime. And that brings us to the second generation, which were deliberately built and planned for long duration missions. The first, which would be actually the next to last Salyut mission, was Salyut 6, which stayed in orbit from September 29th of 1977 to July 29th of 1982. This station would host over its life 16 cosmonaut crew members, including 6 long-duration crews, with the longest lasting 185 days. We didn't know at that time how weightlessness as a human being in long-term duration, how that would affect the bodies. But without the proper exercises, muscles deteriorate. And we would discover over time, including with Soviet experimentation, that your bones, you'll lose muscle mass and you'll lose strength in your bones as well. And so some of the medicines, if you know folks who take medicines to strengthen your bones as you age, some of that came out of early Soviet missions and tests aboard the International Space Station as well. Salyut 6 was the first, as I said, space station to receive large numbers of crewed and uncrewed spacecraft, which brought their supplies. They were the first space station to do an actual crew transfer. In other words, the first crew did not go, come back, the second crew went up. This was a space station that when the first crew was ready to return, the second crew would already be there. And they would take the capsule that the new crew came in and leave the other capsule in case of an emergency. So if another crew came up for the third mission, they would use that one as well. The station now had 2 docking ports, not just one. So they could dock both humans and resupply craft that were unmanned at the same time. Salyut 6 was visited and resupplied over its period of time. It received successful dockings every time. From 1977 to 1981, the station was occupied during 6 separate discontinued intervals. As I said, in one particular instance, they just kind of, hi, good luck, we're leaving. But it also contained a number of crews that would go up and come back. And that brings us to Salyut 7. Salyut 7 was orbiting the planet from 1982 to February of 1991. This was a very long duration lifespan. It had an amazing number of improvements. It had 20 windows with shades and removable glass panels that were darkened that could be put up and taken back down. The first 6 Salyuts basically were generic color schemes. This was improved with multicolors, hopefully to improve morale, and it had a refrigerator aboard. The ceiling on the Salyut 7 was white. The left wall was apple green, and the right one was beige. And their stated purpose was, you can survive in comfort aboard this spacecraft. Salyut 7 had 6 resident crews. The first arrived on May the 23rd of 1982, I believe, on Soyuz T5 and remained there for 211 days. So their durations are getting longer and longer and longer. On the 27th of June, 1983, a crew remained for 150 days. On the 8th of February, 1984, the longest stay aboard Salyut 7 was 237 days. And one of the astronauts brought a guitar with him so he could entertain himself. On June 6th of 1985, there was a malfunction, and that forced a crew to actually do repairs. So on September 17th of 1985, Soyuz T-14 docked with the crew carrying cosmonauts who would actually be responsible for doing those repairs. They, however, had to leave 8 days later and return to Earth, while a second crew remained and undertook the rest of the work. The 1986 mission docked with the space station and stayed for 50 days. The Soyuz craft that brought them actually was the first to transfer from one space station to another, because by this time they had the Mir space station in orbit. So the lifespan of Salyut, you could see it on the horizon. Mir was up and actually running, and the crew that docked in that time period went to Mir, boarded a capsule, came to Salyut 7. Yes, sir?
At what point were they able to boost the orbit up higher?
On Salyut 7?
Or any of the different satellites?
In my reading, basically they were in a stationary geosynchronous orbit. But I can go back and look, that's a good question. But from everything I've been able to read, that was their particular orbit. On the 9th of September in 1983, they were reorienting the space station to perform a radio wave transmission experiment. And one of the cosmonauts noticed that the pressure of one fuel tank had gone to 0. There was no pressure there whatsoever. They found a fuel leak. And they found it by looking through the porthole and seeing fuel being expelled from the tank. Ground control decided that they would try to repair the damaged pipes. And it was the most complex repair ever attempted to that time during a spacewalk or extravehicular activity, EVA. The crew that was on board did not attempt it. Once again, another crew was sent up that would have more expertise and a briefing on what needed to be done. The other reason that the crew that was there didn't attempt it is because they didn't have the tools to actually do it. Tools to directly address the problem had to be ferried up with the subsequent crew. It took 4 EVAs and hours and hours to fix 2 problems to keep the space station particularly viable. And as they were out there doing it, they found out still they did not have the proper tools to complete the total project. And so Soyuz T-12 was launched, which brought additional hardware to be able to solve that problem. This article here from February 11th of 1985 talks about the crew that actually went out and did the repair work. So in 1985, Salyut 7 was lost because the station began to drift. It made unpredictable movements. Ground control could not control it, and so they shut down all of the systems on board. Unfortunately, at that time, the station was uninhabited. But the Soviets decided we're going to try to repair it. And they sent up this crew right here to do that repair work. It was performed on a Soyuz T-13 mission in 1985. There was an author who wrote a book on it, said this was one of the most impressive feats of in-space repair in history. All of this Soviet spacecraft and Salyuts and the Mir were equipped with what were known as automatic rendezvous docking capabilities. And on arrival in 1985, the Soyuz crew that was right here that was attempting to do the repairs was not able to pick up the telemetry that would allow them to dock properly. And so the pilot of this particular mission piloted his ship to intercept the forward port of Salyut 7. You got a spacecraft or a space station up here that is doing unpredictable movements. Ground control can't handle it. They've shut all of the functions down, and the pilot decides he's going to dock with that. You can imagine the difficulty that actually was. And he was able to do that. He was able to do that successfully, pull it off. They entered the space station, Salyut 7. They sampled the atmosphere. They were wearing fur-lined clothing because it was extremely cold in there, about minus 250, 300 degrees inside. Very, very cold. They entered the space station to conduct repairs. The fault was found to be an electrical issue, and they were able to solve that. Once the batteries were replaced and the electrical system was discerned, the station started to charge. The station warmed up over the next few days. All of the systems were brought back online, and Salyut 7 was last inhabited in 1986 by the crew of Soyuz T-15. And they actually, their mission was to take all of the equipment out of here that they thought Mir could use and ferry it over to Mir. And so they not only had the record of going from one space station to another, but they had the record of taking everything out of there that the Soviets thought they could use and taking it back to Mir. And it was a pretty amazing feat. Unexpectedly, because of solar activity, some of you astronomers who've been around a while might remember in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a lot of solar activity that caused some problems with this space station. And in 1981 over Argentina, Salyut 7 actually overshot where it was supposed to come down. And it ended up splashing, I think, partially on ground and partially in the ocean. So the Salyut series were definitely the precursors of Mir. Once the Soviets had success with the Salyuts, they built the Mir and put it into orbit simultaneously. And it also was a good study point for the Americans to develop the International Space Station. So what is some of the space history that Salyut actually achieved? Flights broke space flight records to that time, mission duration records. It was the first crewed station. Overall, 697 days of occupancy. Of that, 1,499 were on Salyut 6 and 7. It had the first orbital handover between crews, as we talked about. It was the first long-term research into humans in space. It actually evolved space-age technology, went from monolithic, which is just one component, to being able to bring other components and attach them, which is what made the International Space Station in part very successful. It had the first multi-port docking ability. Eventually, Salyut would go from 1 to 2 to 4 docking ports. And it paved the way, as I said, for Mir, which would have been the third generation. 1 through 5 Salyuts were first generation, 6 and 7 second generation, and Mir would be the third generation, and of course the International Space Station, which is nearing the end of its life as well, unfortunately. So that is the story of the Soviets getting the first space station into orbit, the second space station into orbit, and all the steps that they went through to achieve the successes that they did. And at this time, I'll try to answer any questions. Yes, Don, yeah.
About 4 slides prior to the explosion, there was a rocket that they went up with. Keep going. Right there. Whoop. No, one more. Keep that one.
Vostok 3 and 4?
Is that, where's the person?
Person's going to be in that little,
In that round?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
so that the Vostoks took the first human beings into space. And there's an interesting story. The kind of international agreement was to achieve records, you had to go into space and land with your capsule. The Soviets always came down on ground. It was probably cheaper. They didn't have to have military crews out into the ocean. They could get to them sooner. But the international rule was that you had to land with the capsule, and the first cosmonauts didn't do that. That was something the Soviets kept silent about. They were actually ejected out of the capsule automatically and parachuted down themselves.
Well, the reason I asked, I'm looking at that, and it's like, is that a man standing up and that's his head? That was my first thought. So how that's pretty big then.
So the later ones which we looked at one earlier, the Voskods, the later ones were continually built for one, but they would squeeze three crew members into that.
And my other question is, they had so many mishaps, and then, like you said, they crammed 3 people into 2. Was their attitude, let's just get this experiment done and see what happens, rather than let's make sure it works before we send humans up?
They were under tremendous pressure to beat the United States to the moon. If you remember that picture of Nikita Khrushchev pounding his shoe, and if you've never seen that, there is film of that online. He told the world at the United Nations that America would be sleeping under a Soviet moon. And in doing some reading, there's a couple of different interpretations to that. One was literally they would land on the moon. Valentina Tereshkova said in 1968 they were going to be there. Fortunately for us, they didn't achieve that. They didn't get there. But one of the interpretations is that we would be sleeping under a Soviet space station and watching it every night traverse across the sky. and that would be the Soviet moon. I remember when I was a kid, and I think it was Telstar, we got to stay up late one night. You know, when you're a kid, you don't care why, you just get to stay up late. And we went outside and watched Telstar go across the night sky. Very few satellites were in space at that time, but that was a big thing, and that's something that I've always remembered, because at the time, if you're old enough to remember, we had ABC, CBS, and NBC, and they were not all in the same town, and you had to have rabbit ears, and you had to move them around, and all of a sudden, you have a communications satellite into space. But part of the reason for the explosion, the deaths at the Netherlands, what's known as the Netherlands disaster, they were under intense pressure to certify this rocket, because it was one of the first ICBMs, International Continental Ballistic Missiles. And when they launched Sputnik, they did it on an ICBM. And we didn't have that technology yet. It would be a couple years down the road, and we knew that if they decided to lob nuclear missiles at us, we couldn't retaliate. So when the rocket didn't go off, and they spent several hours in the bunker, Netherlands was just going insane with the fact that he was going to be punished for not being able to make this project work. And unfortunately, the ultimate punishment happened when that rocket exploded. So the basic answer is yes, they got the first satellite in space. Haha, look what we did, Americans. They got the first man in space. We beat you to that. They got the first animal, Sputnik 2 in space. Look at that, we did that within 30 days. And they got the first woman to walk in space. And we're demoralized here in the United States. There was, as I said earlier, a kind of a depressive atmosphere at NASA, that they were just beating the pants off of us. And they were willing to make the sacrifices to beat us to the moon. Yes?
They had both space stations up there at the same time. How close to each other were they?
I don't think they got anywhere near.
They couldn't wave to each other?
No, not like the Voskhod earlier, where they were within 4 miles of us. Now, we later did that in Gemini, if you remember. I think that was the Go Navy beat Army, Go Army beat Navy incident. But it was three and a half years later before we achieved that feat. Yes?
Yeah. You said that the Soviets, of course, never got to the moon. Did they ever...
Human beings on the moon.
Kind of a scheme they were going to land on the moon, how they were going to go about doing it, as opposed to the way the Americans did it, where we sent up a rocket to orbit the moon, and then you go down onto the moon and you come back up to the command module or whatever it's called, and then you come back, all three of them. Did they use a similar scheme, or did they come up with something entirely different?
You know, Tereskova never said, and I've never read, but that's a good question too. That would be something to go looking for.
They had a different rocket design.
They had their Proton 2.
They had the N1, thank you, which we have a model of it on our 3rd floor. It had, so our Saturn rocket had 5 engines.
Yeah.
Theirs had like 30 engines. It was this monster of a rocket that just never took off. So, but it was the same idea, was that it would be a rocket into space. It would detach, they would go down, come back up, come back.
Oh, it was the same concept.
It was the same concept, just the rockets were completely different.
Okay, so did they steal it from us? Did we steal it from them? Or what?
I think that's different to opinion. Probably, but I don't really know. Yes.
So that's a good point, because has anybody ever watched that Disney Man in Space? Go to YouTube and watch it. Von Braun and the other German scientists explain how they're going to do it. How they'll have a multi-stage, multi-engine rocket, how they'll go up, land, and come back.
This is back in the 50s?
1955. Walt Disney and Von Braun paired together to present this to the American public and get the American public's favor on board with supporting this program. And what I think is the neat thing about that is you get to see the Germans that came over here as part of Operation Paperclip, about half a dozen of them are on that program. You get to listen to them talk about the expertise. And it's mixed in with some animation on how they're going to do things such as that. So it's very informing. And it wouldn't surprise me if Khrushchev saw it, because if you remember, I think it was 1959, Khrushchev came to the United States, wanted to go to Disneyland, and he was denied entrance into Disneyland because of security concerns. And that really, I think, angered him and probably pushed him just to beat the pants off of us. And they did for many years. But yes, go watch that. Disney's Man in Space on YouTube. It's an incredible program. They did 3 of them, 1 in 55 and I think 2 in 57. And the second one was about going to Mars. And in animation, they show how they're going to do it.
Was it true to the video?
You know, there were some differences, but when you consider 1955 and 1969, there are going to be some evolving differences that come into play. The original lunar module was supposed to have been a design with lots of windows and seats, and it ended up to be no seats, which cut down on the weight, and they stood up and they had these tiny little windows they looked out of. So you'll see, it's kind of the same, it's the word I'm looking for, the same concept, but it evolves over time to be actually workable instead of, hey, this is a great idea, let's see if we can make this work. Well, thank you very much. I think Bree's going to let us know who's coming up next month. I'm very excited about this. But we appreciate you coming, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Mike, for a great lecture. So next month, we have a brand new speaker. She is the newest member of our education team. Her name is Becca Michael. She's there in the back if you haven't been able to meet her yet. Her topic is going to be Clyde Tombaugh. Sorry, I almost flipped that around. And the New Horizons. So that's going to be a very exciting, something new, get us going again. Yeah, I like that in this new year. But other than that, the only other announcement we have is that the Astronomy League is going to be here on the 9th. So if you want to join us, what time is that at? 7 p.m. 7 p.m. here. We'll have the doors open for you. But other than that, we just want to thank you guys for continuing to support our museum and these lectures, and we really love having you here. So we have some more donuts in the back. We have some more coffee. Make sure you get refills before you leave. And I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.